Hundreds of witnesses saw a bizarre, erratic light flying over the city, like an arc lamp. It made no noise, just light, and it appeared to be suspended beneath a dark shape that many would say looked like a cigar. Welcome to the Paranormal Post. I'm Clayton Morris. If you love true stories of the unexplained, then go ahead and smash that like button. It really helps. And please subscribe to the channel. There's one more thing you can do. That's to turn on the bell notification so you'll receive a notification when we publish a new video. Well, as crazy as this may sound, UFO sightings are nothing out of the usual these days. We have hundreds or even thousands of pieces of footage of unidentified flying objects all over the world, right? And it may be hard to realize that these sightings have always happened, but people just didn't have an iPhone in their pocket to record it. In this video, we're going to talk about the phantom airships that swarmed American skies in the 1890s. It began on a cold and gloomy evening in Sacramento, the capital of California, located east of San Francisco in the middle of the state's fertile Central Valley. On November 17th, after a particularly gray day, hundreds of witnesses saw an erratic light flying over the city, like an arc lamp. Now, an arc lamp is something similar to the bat signal or those old spotlights that used to attract people to go see a movie. According to newspaper reports, it made no noise. This light appeared to be suspended beneath a dark shape that many would liken to a cigar. Now, beyond this, reports varied. It either had rudders or propellers, or it did not at all. And some said pilots could be seen operating its workings, turning something by working bicycle pedals. More than that, they could be heard. People could hear them. And when they descended near the buildings below, witnesses heard them shouting things like, "Lift her up, quick!" And some streetcar workers heard music and a voice that said, "Well, we ought to go to San Francisco by noon tomorrow," as the craft flew away to the southwest against the prevailing wind. So for the next few days, hubbub circulated in Sacramento Evening Bee newspaper and the San Francisco Chronicle and the San Francisco Call. But there was little sign of the airship until passengers on an Oakland cable car claimed to have seen an airship with a searchlight on November 21st. That's when it went from an isolated incident to a full-blown flap, with thousands of sightings on one day across multiple cities: Sacramento, Oakland, San Jose, San Francisco, where it eventually floated over landmark buildings and the bay, which scared off seals with its arc light. Seals always hang around the bay in San Francisco. This, of course, would mean an impossibly fast ship, or numerous ships, or, frankly, just false reports. And at least some hoax or mistaken sightings seemed likely, since after that day, appearances of the airship or ships seemed to be spreading in many different directions. On the 25th of November, it was seen in 11 different places, again, around Sacramento and the Bay Area, but also north of the Bay Area in Napa and Petaluma, where some ingenious entrepreneurs charged admission to view the airship through their telescope, and even as far as Chico, California, which is 81 miles north of Sacramento. On November 29th, a Bakersfield newspaper reported a sighting, but also included the opinion of an astronomy professor that it was only a sighting of Mars or Venus. I don't know about you, but I look up at Venus, I can clearly tell the difference between a planet way off in the distance and a flying airship with people talking. And then on November 30th, residents of Los Angeles saw 3 lights overhead. But a local expert on bicycle assured the newspaper it was just likely the university students pranking the city by attaching some reflectors to a balloon and lifting it up. On the 1st of December, another airship appeared over Oakland, a 100-foot-long cigar-shaped object with a triangular fishtail rudder. Its surface appeared to be aluminum that was somehow darkened by weathering, and it zoomed off at high speed towards San Francisco. But it was seen again later that same day, making the same maneuver in the same direction. Then on December 3rd, an airship was seen in no fewer than 6 locations: in San Francisco, in Viejo, where it had been reported that residents had been searching the skies, disappointed at not seeing an airship. Now they were becoming very common. and then in a scattering of smaller towns to the east, Davis, California, Dixon, Browns Valley, and North Bloomfield, all indicating an easterly flight path, except that later in December on the 17th, a ship was seen further west in Biggs, California. And then the last sightings in California after the new year happened away south there in Lodi, California. Still, if one were inclined to believe in a real airship or airships flying around California that fall, one might discern a vague course of travel from Sacramento to the Bay Area and back and forth and around for a few jaunts before setting off eastward toward the interior of the country. Now, the first indication that the airship sightings were not over and done with came in February of 1897, when an airship was reported sulking around Hastings, Nebraska, some 1,200 miles from where one had last been seen in California. Now, some assumed this was the same airship that had been seen in California, and that it had made a miraculous flight over the Rocky Mountains, difficult at best for an airship, with all of the turbulent winds. Even though the original report seems to indicate that the airship had been seen around Hastings during the previous autumn as well, but just hadn't been reported in the newspaper. Meanwhile, another reporter around 100 miles north in Norfolk remarked that it would be interesting to know just what brand of liquor the Hastings correspondent drinks that enables him to see airships carrying powerful lights gyrating about through the atmosphere. It must be a remarkable brand of goods, and we would be glad to try a few gallons of it. Joking, basically, that, hey, what is he drinking? Well, despite aspersions cast by snarky newspapermen in Nebraska, sightings continued. On February 6th, south of Hastings, in Innervale, 6 folks leaving a prayer meeting heard voices overhead and spied a 39 to 40-foot airship with a bright headlamp and 6 smaller running lights. In fact, during this flap, a reported sighting spiderwebbed out all over in Hastings, appearing in clockwise locations like York, McCool Junction, Lincoln, McCook, Big Springs, and North Platte, Nebraska, where some trouble reportedly caused the ship to descend into a shower of sparks. By the 16th of that month, a ship arrived over Omaha, where a girl saw it and ran into a party being held at 26th and H. She encouraged everyone to come out and have a look at the funny thing in the sky, quoting her, funny thing in the sky, leading to a few dozen more witnesses seeing the object aloft around 400 to 500 feet in the air. These airships, if real, then seem to have been grounded for a while after that. But in April, they returned in force. It seemed, with reports in Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, and all the way east to New York, and then way down south in Texas. Now, researchers have tracked down more than 150 sightings in around 20 different states, far more than I could possibly state without it becoming repetitive and boring. Just know there were a ton of sightings. Nevertheless, let's take a look at a few of these encounters in April, some of them astonishing. The Chicago Tribune started their coverage by claiming that hundreds had seen a ship in Omaha on the 6th of April, and continued by reporting on the 10th of April that hundreds had spotted a winged airship above their very own Windy City. The Chicago Herald thereafter printed the claims of one William McCann, who along with 3 others said he had seen and photographed an airship over Rogers Park. The Herald printed an illustration from a wood carving of McCann's photo, which we still have today for examination. It's unfortunate that newspapers could not at the time print photographs, otherwise we might actually have a blurry picture of a phantom airship. As it turned out, however, the photograph itself has been lost, if it ever actually existed. We do, though, have reports that the plates of the photo were given an acid test and determined to be genuine before the Herald printed its illustration. But the Tribune, on the other hand, pronounced the photo to be a fraud on April 12th, citing the cryptic proof that it, quote, displayed too much scope of lens, end quote. And while the Chicago newspapermen squabbled, the airships seemed to float inexorably onward, appearing in both Jefferson, Iowa, Kalamazoo, Michigan on April 15th, although these two couldn't possibly be the same airships. Even disregarding the fact that an aircraft traveling 450 miles in a day at that time would have been ludicrous, we also have the reports of multiple airship crashes in Greene County. Curiously, just as the airship crashes were reaching its highest elevation in the Midwest and reports of airships falling to the earth were becoming more popular to talk about, A spate of sightings took off in Texas, many of these reporting landings as well as crashes in Texas. Now, on April 20th, the Galveston Daily News gave a highly detailed report of a ship seen in Texas by Sheriff H.W. Baylor. A bright light and the sound of voices drew him out into an alleyway behind his house, where he found an airship with wings and fins. A crew of 3 men said hello to him, asking for water and explaining that they were on a trial run with their airship. One man called himself Wilson, claiming to be from Goshen, New York. And discovering that Baylor was a sheriff, he asked, "Do you know a Captain C.C. Akers, who used to be the sheriff of Zavala County?" Wilson claimed to have met Akers in Fort Worth in 1877. Baylor told him that Akers was then at the Eagle Pass working for the Customs Service, and Wilson asked him to say hello for him. He and the others then took water from Baylor's yard and flew away north. This uncommonly detailed story even had a corroborating witness in the county clerk, Henry J. Bowles, who apparently saw the ship leaving Baylor's alley. And other articles appear to have confirmed with C.C. Akers that he was indeed made the acquaintance of someone named Wilson at one point, although it's a common name. But still, the seeming credibility of the witnesses, a sheriff and a county clerk, has led many to give these reports credence. Nevertheless, despite the apparent reliability of witnesses in these matters, it should be remembered that the true source of these accounts are the newspapers that reported them. Hoaxes appeared frequently in newspapers during these years, and often the reliable witnesses they named had come right out in the imagination of the fraudsters who wrote them. With the question of the reliability of newspaper reports hanging over this entire affair, we now turn to one of the most fanciful explanations of these phantom airship sightings, that they were really extraterrestrial spacecrafts. There are, in fact, some newspaper reports that indicate the objects in the sky may have come from away across the ocean, which would make it extremely unlikely that these were maiden flights of experimental aircraft. On September 20th, 1896, a Professor Swift spied a light of the magnitude of Venus over the Pacific Ocean and sent a telegram to a Professor Perrins at Lick Observatory, wondering if he discovered a new comet. And on October 22nd, none other than the mayor of San Francisco, Adolph Sutro, reported that several people had seen a light flying eastward about 500 feet above the surface of the Pacific, and that emitted an electrical glow. But these reports do little more than indicate that Mars and Venus and meteors and comets might have frequently been mistaken for flying lights. Some reports of crashed airships in Iowa certainly added to this hysteria. In fact, a man who climbed down into the crater in Jefferson carrying a Volapük dictionary with him, Volapük meaning world language. It was a constructed international language, like the subsequently more common Esperanto. One can only imagine who the intrepid investigator thought he might encounter at the bottom of that crater that he brought that dictionary with him. And of course, one does not have to wonder, as other newspaper reports described encounters with extraterrestrial creatures. And on an empty road outside of Springfield, Missouri, one W.M. Hopkins, a traveling salesman, saw a landed airship while driving his wagon, and outside of it, 2 naked aliens. He kissed their hands and boarded their craft when he was invited on, and when it began to ascend, he escaped abduction only by jumping off, he says. And in late April, a farmer named Alexander Hamilton, who was with his son and a farmhand, saw a 300-foot ship with a carriage-like construct beneath it, crewed by an odd-looking family man, a woman, and a child. This airship actually lowered a rope and carried away a struggling calf. Hamilton and the others gave chase but lost the ship. Later, another farmer named Lank Thomas found the calf's remains, which consisted only of skin, legs, and a head. This could be an early report of cattle mutilation, complete with reliable officials swearing to its veracity at the time, as 11 men, including the postmaster and the sheriff and the justice of the peace, all swore in a written affidavit of what they saw. But perhaps the longest-lived of all of these reports came out of Texas. In the Dallas Morning News of April 19, 1897, a column attributed to a correspondent named Hayden with the headline, "A Windmill Demolishes It," told a wild tale of an airship with some mechanical malfunction flying low over Aurora, Texas, perhaps the most famous of all airship mystery sightings. It struck a windmill on the land of one Judge Proctor and then exploded, spreading debris over acres of land. Those first that were on the scene found only one pilot, horribly injured from the explosion. But to everyone who was apparently there, could see plainly that he was not of this earth. In fact, according to Hayden, a signal corpsman named T.J. Weems was given an authority on astronomy, expressed the opinion that the pilot must have been a Martian. And to further excite speculation, Hayden reported that the pilot had some papers that he was carrying, miraculously intact after the explosion that had so horribly disfigured his body, and they were inscribed with strange hieroglyphics. Finally, he claimed the ship was composed of some unknown metal, though he cites no expert opinion on this detail. There was no metallurgist on hand to confirm this. Oddly, though, the piece ends with the tidbit that they would be giving this otherworldly creature a standard Christian funeral. The simple fact that this news did not make waves at the time tells us that those who read it probably thought it was one of the tall tales or hoaxes that were common in newspapers back then, which most people could easily discern were not meant to be taken seriously. Not until ufologists in the early 1970s looked into it did it really become a legend. MUFON investigators descended on Aurora, Texas, and walked the land with metal detectors, hoping to turn up some of that alien metal. Some iron alloy that seemed to not display magnetic properties one might expect actually was found, but this ended up being an iron zinc roofing shingle, nothing exciting. Undeterred, though, they scoured the local cemetery for the unmarked grave of the alien, and indeed found a site with a marker that looked like it depicted an airship. Authorities, however, refused to let them go digging up graves, and when the marker ended up stolen, likely by one of the ufologists themselves, they cried conspiracy. But perhaps the real conspiracy had taken place back in 1897, for recent historical research indicates that Hayden, the author of the article, had an agenda. Aurora had recently been devastated by agricultural problems. There were fires, a failed railroad, and so-called spotted fever or typhus, which had taken Hayden's wife and sons. It had been suggested that Hayden may have penned the hoax in an effort to promote his dying town. Some skeptics say that there's a simpler and far more believable explanation that there are little green men flying around. They suggest that they might be normal earthling men. After all, it's not like there was no one working on creating flying machines at the time. We just might not have known about them. So the question then becomes, who were the inventors of these aircrafts? Right from the very start of the California flap, there are plenty of candidates offered up by the newspapers covering the story. In the first article to report an airship, the Sacramento Evening Bee, by way of explanation for the outlandish sighting, said it was a New York man. He built an airship. He would be flying to California in it, though they offered no further details. And then in the LA paper, almost in the same breath as it insisted that the ships were all mistaken sightings of Mars and Venus, then claimed that the ship's inventor was a man from Los Angeles. And well before the attorney Hart had made his claims about the ship's mission to Cuba, another prominent lawyer, George D. Collins, claims to represent the inventor of the ship that had been seen. The inventor's name was E.H. Benjamin. And Collins said after 7 years of work, bankrolled by a mysterious company and using parts manufactured on the East Coast, he had been successful and had already made several flights. According to a New York Herald article that appeared during the April flap the following year, the ship described by Collins was 150 feet long, with wings, and would fly eastward next, which would tend to explain the path of the sightings. On April 10th, the Herald claimed that one Max Haar, secretary of the Chicago Aeronautical Association, claimed to be expecting a powered, steerable airship with a crew of 3 people out of San Francisco on its way for D.C. Another suspect out of Omaha was one Alva J. Grover, who had reportedly shown people plans for a powered, steerable airship. And yet another was a country tinkerer named John O. Priest, who, it was said, had covered the walls of his home with drawings of his airships. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch on April 25th reported an airship like a headless, tailless fish with propellers and wings and a 9-foot-long passenger car. It landed for repairs, and its pilot, a Professor Charles Davidson, claimed to have left Sacramento a month earlier. And on May 7th, the Chicago Tribune gave a similarly detailed description of an airship that, according to the New York Times article at the time, described the same craft 40 feet long with propellers attached to a bicycle for taking off. Its inventor was reported as Professor Arthur W. Barnard of Nashville, and he claimed he had demonstrated the airship at the Tennessee Centennial Exposition, to general amazement. But apparently, there was no news coverage of it. Now, not all candidates for inventing the airship were named by newspapers during this flap. For example, researcher and my friend Micah Hanks dug up a patent filed in April 1896 by one Charles Abbott Smith of San Francisco, an inventor of some repute, who had previously sold some patents for tools useful to shoemakers, farmers, and builders. And in a San Francisco Call article some 9 months before the California flap, Smith talks about his proposed airship, and mention is made that the U.S. government may have been offering $100,000 for the invention of a working airship. This may be relevant to the story of another popular contender for our airship inventor. John Worrell Keeley was a tuning fork researcher. He began experimentation to try to determine how vibrations might allow him to tap into the power of luminiferous ether, the medium by which light was propagated and the stuff that many believe filled an empty space. By 1872, he claimed a breakthrough and convinced some wealthy capitalists to bankroll his motor company, for soon he'd build an engine and use his proprietary technology. In 1874, he demonstrated his etheric generator, a device that ran on vapor produced by ordinary tap water, and yet produced enough energy to break iron bars and drive bullets into wood. Whenever his investors wanted progress, he always had a new device to demonstrate in a dramatic fashion, showing how musical tones he played on his flute or harmonica could, through vibration, activate etheric energy and therefore operate the machines that he showed them, such as the hydropneumatic pulsating vacuum engine. Some, however, suggest the music was only a signal to hidden accomplices, indicating when to operate the machinery who were hidden in his lab. Then in 1884, he demonstrated a vaporic gun for the government at Sandy Hook, impressing some and not impressing others, who complained that a healthy donkey could kick harder than the projectile that it struck. Then in 1896, perhaps trying to win that $100,000 offered by the government, he gave a demonstration that showed a revolving copper sphere and claimed that it showed his manipulation of polar-dipolar force, further giving explanation that gravity is nothing more than a concordant, attractive, sympathetic stream flowing towards the neutral center of the Earth. All of which is to say that he would soon be able to control gravity and therefore raise the heavy airships into the sky. While many would like to believe that it was his astounding science that raised the airships of that year, the truth is there is no evidence that he ever accomplished this or any of his other plans. After his death, skeptics raided his lab, and no one could ever make his devices work as he had done in demonstrations. So he's remembered today as one of the history's greatest frauds. While it's tempting to believe that a human inventor really made these airships, considering all of the many inventors and true balloonists diligently working in those years to perfect a powered, steerable airship capable of the kinds of flights reported in 1896 and 1897, the simple fact that these ships were not demonstrated to great fanfare in public exhibitions, as nearly every major flight before them had been, tends to cast doubt on the idea of them being real at all. And where are the photographs? The mysterious Wilson, who supposedly piloted a ship around Texas, claimed that this was because no patent had been filed yet, so they didn't want their invention stolen. But this strains credulity as well. What inventor would wait until well after the successful completion and flight test of their airship to file a patent? And even if one were to accept this explanation, there remains the final question of why. After the April 1897 flap, the airships were never seen again, ever. Surely they had proven viable, so much so that people were having conversations hovering off the ground? Why would no one patent them and go public at this point? So then we're left with the theory that these sightings were artifacts of yellow journalism, a media hoax. Some have pointed out that the Midwest sightings clearly suggest that the travel eastward along the path of the telegraph line, suggesting that one newspaper perpetrated its hoax and next received word of it by telegraph and perpetuated it. But there are problems with this theory as well. Even in the era of yellow journalism, a newspaper's reputation could be damaged by engaging in an outright fraud, especially in such an extended way. These were legitimate news sources, not supermarket tabloids like we have today, and they were often in direct competition with other papers that would jump at the chance to prove their rivals were spreading misinformation. Moreover, when these papers did print outrageous hoaxes like those written by Mulhausen, they were usually standalone stories, often so absurd that their readers could easily determine what was news and what was satire meant only for entertainment. These sightings, however, were reported over and over again, like real news, And in between eyewitness reports, the correspondents often injected their own vocal skepticism, such as the San Francisco Examiner of December 5th, 1896. Quote, "Fake journalism has a good deal to answer for, but we do not recall a more discernible exploit in that line that the persistent attempt to make the public believe that the air in this vicinity is populated with airships," end quote. Perhaps it's impossible now to make heads or tails of this mess. It seems like people must have seen something, at least in Sacramento, at the beginning of things. If there truly were no ships in the sky and never had been, how did this hysteria even get started? Is it possible that some combination of all of the various theories offer the best explanation? Maybe they were real sightings at first, and maybe some or all of those had been mistakes, confusing Venus, which was bright that year, or a big box kite in the air, as has been put forth as an explanation for the airship sightings. Then perhaps, as newspapers wanting to boost sales wrote up these reports, they embellished them, added some flair for details and numbers of witnesses. After that, it was spread by telegraph to other locales, which then caused people to look for airships in their skies, and to make further mistaken sightings or even to perpetrate hoax sightings. Some newspaper articles seem to even playfully toe the line between professional skepticism and engagement in hysteria. What do you think hit the skies in the late 1800s across the United States? Extraterrestrials, hoaxes, or real airships with folks that hadn't made patents yet in order to keep them quiet? Let me know in the comments below. And if you like this video, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already done so you'll never miss one of our videos, and share it with someone who likes stories of the unexplained. We'll see you next time.